Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm here today to make my next Shakespeare video. Shakespeare is an annual event that takes place on BookTube where we celebrate the works of William Shakespeare in the month of September. If you don't know about this event and you want further information about it, I will leave links to the announcement videos for the event that the hosts of the event posted. So you can go check those out if you want more information. But without further ado, I want to talk about the Shakespeare play that I ended up reading for Shakespeare. And that play is Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Now, Pericles is not one of Shakespeare's plays that is super widely known. A lot of people don't even know about it. Like, if you just brought up in conversation to a regular person who you picked off the street and asked them if they'd ever heard of the Shakespeare play Pericles, they probably would have no clue what you're talking about. And the reason for that is that it's not the Shakespeare play that gets taught in high school, certainly, even I suspect in like college courses on English literature, or even just college courses on Shakespeare, I would imagine, often would leave out Pericles. It's just not one of his plays that seems to capture the zeitgeist in the way that Hamlet does or Macbeth does, and so on and so forth. And so it's a play that just a lot of people don't know very much about and haven't read, a lot of people. And I will say that I had read Pericles once before, several years ago. I didn't remember very much about it, other than that, one, it was super weird, and two, it seemed very, very different from Shakespeare's other plays that I had read. And I think that assessment was accurate on my second reading, but I have a lot more thoughts on it on this second reading. And so Pericles is one of Shakespeare's later plays, one of his so-called late romances. Shakespeare's late romances, like Pericles, like The Tempest, like The Winter's Tale, like Cymbeline to a degree, tend to incorporate elements of both tragedies and comedies. And so they sometimes are also referred to as tragicomedies. And they tend to incorporate these kind of fantastical elements, what we would probably now call fantastical elements. These elements of the supernatural playing a role in the story. In a much more explicit way than in Shakespeare's tragedies or his comedies, even. And so to start with a bit of a summary of what Pericles is about, I'm not going to summarize the whole plot of Pericles, because one thing that you'll find, just based on what I'm going to summarize of Pericles, is its plot is totally insane. The plot is full of coincidences and improbabilities and fantastical elements that come to play a role, and even a sort of deus ex machina that happens at one point. But I'm going to summarize enough of the play to just give you the gist of what it's about. So I'm going to summarize kind of the first quarter to a third of it. I don't want to spoil the whole thing, although eventually I am actually going to read from the very final scene of the play, but I'll do that at the end so that people who don't want spoilers won't suffer. So Pericles is about the title character, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, and as Prince of Tyre, Pericles actually rules over Tyre in his own right. So even though he's the Prince of Tyre, he is a ruler in his own right. And Tyre is a city in the eastern Mediterranean, for those who aren't aware. And at the opening of the play, Pericles finds himself in the court of King Antiochus. And Pericles is trying to convince King Antiochus to let him marry his daughter, to marry Antiochus's daughter. And notably, Antiochus's daughter is unnamed, but Antiochus has this thing where he requires any man who wants to marry his daughter to first solve a riddle. And the catch is that if the man solves the riddle, he gets to marry his daughter, but if he doesn't solve the riddle, he gets executed. And so the fact that the daughter is still unmarried and that there are a bunch of heads hanging from the top of Antiochus's walls you know that a lot of men have failed to figure out this riddle. And so Pericles takes the challenge, and when he hears the riddle, he almost immediately knows what the riddle says. And what this riddle actually says, and it's not really that hard to discern if you're an attentive reader, I don't think, but what the riddle says is that King Antiochus is engaged in an incestuous affair with his daughter. That's what the riddle says. And so Pericles finds himself between a rock and a hard place, because he knows that if he reveals the actual meaning of the riddle, it'll piss Antiochus off, and he'll probably execute him because he doesn't want it to be widely known that he's in an incestuous relationship with his daughter. But if he doesn't reveal the meaning of the riddle, he'll get executed for not solving the riddle. And so Pericles is between a rock and a hard place, and so he flees. He flees out to sea. And so Pericles flees from his own execution out to sea, and unluckily for him, his ship ends up getting into a storm, and they get shipwrecked. And he washes on the shore near the city of Pentapolis. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name of that city correctly, but that's how I'm going to say it. So Pericles washes up on the shore of Pentapolis, and that's kind of the first scene where the first kind of fantastical element occurs. So when Pericles washes up on the shore, right next to him, a suit of armor washes up with him. And the suit of armor just happens to be his own father's old suit of armor. And that armor turns out to be critical for Pericles in the very next scene, because Pericles decides to go to the court of the king of Pentapolis, who's named Simonides, and what he finds in that court is that Simonides also has a beautiful daughter, this time with a name. Her name is Thaisa. I'm also not sure if that's how you're supposed to say her name, but that's how I'm going to say it because I think it sounds nice. But Simonides has a daughter named Thaisa, and they are in the middle of a kind of competition for Thaisa's hand in marriage. So there's a bunch of knights in court all vying for Thaisa's hand, and they have to joust with each other, they have to dance, they have to do other things. And Pericles takes part in this competition, and as you may imagine, he totally blows away the competition. He is the best of all the knights, and Thaisa just happens to also be smitten with him. And so Pericles and Thaisa are happily married, and Thaisa gets pregnant, and then Pericles and Thaisa go out to sea again. And I presume that they're on their way back to Tyre on this sea voyage. But what happens is that they run into another storm at sea. They run into another tempest. And during this storm, Thaisa goes into labor and dies giving birth to their daughter. And Pericles' crew actually convince him that they need to throw Thaisa's body off the ship, or else the storm won't go away. And so Pericles takes his wife, puts her in a coffin with some jewels and other valuables, and puts her out to sea. And his daughter, his newly born daughter, he names Marina, which is a rather lovely name. And so Thaisa is put out to sea, and then Pericles, in despair, lands at the city of Tarsus. And at the city of Tarsus, he leaves his daughter with the king and queen of Tarsus, Cleon and Dionysa. And so Marina, his daughter, is going to be raised by Cleon and Dionysa. And Thaisa, meanwhile, has floated in her coffin happily to the shore next to a doctor's home. And this doctor/sorcerer guy opens up her coffin, sees her, and says, oh, actually, she's not dead. I can, revive her. And so she's revived and becomes a priestess of Diana. And so the rest of the play is mostly about Marina, mostly focuses on Marina in Tarsus and her journey. And the end of the play, slight spoiler here, but the end of the play has, I think, one of Shakespeare's best recognition scenes or reunion scenes. Just one of his best, I think. One of his most just like heartwarming and moving reunion scenes. So anyway, so this play has a lot going on in it, and the plot, again, is just totally wild. I'm not going to summarize it anymore, but there are a couple of things that I find interesting in Pericles. The one that I find most interesting in Pericles is how many instances we have in this play and I'm not sure how to say this, and this might sound a little bit pompous, but I'm gonna unpack what I mean with some examples. But the label of a person, place, or thing contradicting directly its essence. So a thing is labeled as one thing, but in reality, it's the exact opposite. So, for example, we have, Marina at one point starts to work in a brothel, but she refuses to actually do the deed with any of the customers, and actually starts to instead of doing the deed with the customers, she convinces the customers into being chaste. So we have a chaste prostitute, right? We also have caretakers who try to have the child they're taking care of murdered. So King Cleon and Queen Dionysa of Tarsus at one point try to have Marina, the girl they've been tasked with bringing up, killed. Mainly because Dionysa thinks of Marina as a rival to her own daughter in her skills and in her beauty and so on and so forth. We also have a father and a daughter who act like man and wife, Antiochus and his daughter. We also, in the form of that storm that was affecting Pericles' ship, the storm where his daughter was born, the crew of the ship seemed to believe that the storm was brought about by them having a dead body on board. And so they need to get rid of the dead body to get rid of the storm. But as we find, that couldn't have been the case because Thaisa wasn't dead. She wasn't dead. And so this storm, which this crew thought was supernatural, was actually totally natural and totally coincidental. We also have a Vestal virgin of Diana who's not a virgin. Thaisa goes and becomes a priestess of Diana who is sort of the goddess of virginity. But Thaisa, as we know, is not a virgin because she's given birth, so she must have done the deed at some point. And Marina, at one point, there is a tomb built for Marina, even though she is not dead. So we have a tomb for a person who's alive. So we have all these these people, places, and things that directly contradict what people think they are based on what they're labeled with. And I think that's so fascinating that there's just so many examples of that in this play. I mean, even looking at the title, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, right? He's a prince, but he's the head of state, right? And I know that there have been a lot of city-states and small principalities where the head of the state is a prince. But still, when we hear the name prince, we think of someone who's going to succeed to rule as king. But that's not the case with Pericles. He's the prince of Tyre, and he is the ruler of Tyre. But, another spoiler alert, Pericles does actually become a king at the end of this play. And so, in a sense, he does come to fulfill that more literal sense of the title prince. But what I find so interesting about all these contradictions is that it seems like Shakespeare is deliberately trying to undermine our usual associations with these different concepts, of what a prostitute is, what a tomb is, what a virgin is, what a ruler is, what a father and daughter are, right? And I find that so interesting, and that honestly that feels very modern to me, even though this play also feels so much like kind of a fairy tale, like a fantasy, right? Because there are, as I've already hopefully shown, a lot of fantastical elements in it. The thing that I like the most about it is articulated by Marjorie Garber in her book Shakespeare After All. And so she has obviously a great chapter in this on Pericles. I want to read you two things that she says about Pericles. And the first one is referring to the nature of Pericles as a tragic comedy and as a romance. And she says this: "If we consider all this, we will realize that dramatic romance, or as it was then known, tragic comedy, cannot and ought not be judged exclusively by its realism or its social commentary. Romance speaks about society by speaking about poetry, art, dream, and transcendence, and about the quest of the individual as human being and as art maker for identity and eternity." And so the plot of Pericles, again, is full of these improbabilities, these improbable coincidences, I should say, occurring in order to bring about a happy ending. But Marjorie Garber is saying that we shouldn't judge it in the way that we judge typical plots of typical realist plays or movies or books. We should judge it as a sort of fairy tale, as sort of occupying the realm of psychology more than the realm of the real world. And she says at one point, in one of my favorite passages that she has on Pericles, that one of the primary aspects of Pericles is wonder, that it's wonderful, but not wonder in the way that we tend to think of it now. When we say something's wonderful, we're just kind of using it as a synonym for it's great, it's awesome, right? But she emphasizes that it's wonderful in the older sense of the word, right? So she says, Pericles is wonderful, producing wonder, amazement, and astonishment. Wonder is the emotion that greets a marvel or a prodigy. It was the chief object of the Jacobean court masque, intended to produce a spectacle so imposing that it would generate a kind of catharsis of the imagination, a recognition not of human suffering, but of superhuman possibility and beauty. Wonder in this sense is what is felt and expressed in all the key scenes of Pericles. And yeah, I think that this play has a lot of unrealistic things happen in it, right? And anyone who is reading it, thinking about the actual plausibility of the plot, will probably balk at it because it has so many improbable coincidences, right? But the way that I ended up kind of interpreting Pericles was Marjorie Garber also goes to some lengths to compare Pericles to Lear of King Lear. And so I found that comparison really apt. And the reason is that I think what Pericles kind of is as a play is a demonstration of all of the improbable coincidences that would have to happen to bring about the best ending possible for all the characters. So in that sense, it's kind of a fantasy, kind of a dream. And Marjorie Garber, again, goes to great lengths to compare the world of Pericles to the world of dream. She cites Freudian psychology and all this. And so I think Pericles is supposed to be kind of a dream. It's not realistic. It's a fantasy about how everything might end for the best for everyone. And as that, I found it really actually quite powerful, especially towards the end. The last two scenes of Pericles, I feel like, are two of the most beautiful in all of Shakespeare. I don't necessarily think Pericles is top-tier Shakespeare, and I'm going to end by talking a little bit about why. But the last two scenes of Pericles are just some of my favorite in Shakespeare. I think it's one of his best reunion scenes, one of his best recognition scenes. And so I want to read a little bit from this scene. And this is going to be a spoiler, so if you don't want spoilers, then I'll try to remember to add timestamps for spoilers here, because this is going to be a big spoiler. But this isn't really a play where you're supposed to be on the edge of your seat about what's going to happen next. It's really more about the experience. So here's spoilers begin. So this is the scene where Marina and Pericles are reunited. Pericles, in grief over the loss of his wife and then the loss of his daughter, has stopped talking. He's gone completely mute, and he's let his hair and beard grow out extremely long. And that image of him unspeaking with long hair and a long beard, already I found really powerful. Because Pericles is on the stage from the start of this scene, but he doesn't speak until well into it. And I find that already really powerful. But the person who gets him to start to talk is his daughter, who he doesn't at first know is his daughter, of course. All right, so I'm going to start from when Marina, his now grown daughter, starts to speak to him. She starts, actually, I think it's rather lovely, she starts by singing to him. And it doesn't give any lyrics for her singing, but it says that she sings. And I love that because Marina is supposed to be really skilled at all of the basically all of the liberal arts. She's a great singer, she's great at writing, she's at art, at dancing and all this. And Pericles was supposed to have been good at those things as well, as shown by his performance in the competition between the knights earlier. But so she sings, and then starts to speak to him. And so she says, "Hail, sir, my lord, lend ear." And Pericles at first just says, "Hum, ha," like he's not going to talk to her. But she has gotten something out of him, right? Unlike everyone else in this scene. And then she says, "I am a maid, my lord, that ne'er before invited eyes, but have been gazed on like a comet. She speaks, my lord, that maybe hath endured a grief might equal yours, if both were justly weighed. Though wayward fortune did malign my state, my derivation was from ancestors who stood equivalent with mighty kings. But time hath rooted out my parentage, and to the world and awkward casualties bound me in servitude." And then as an aside, she adds, "I will desist, but there is something glows upon my cheek, and whispers in mine ear, go not till he speak." And then Pericles responds, "My fortunes, parentage, good parentage, to equal mine? Was it not thus? What say you?" And Marina responds, "I said, my lord, if you did know my parentage, you would not do me violence." And Pericles says, "I do think so. I pray you, turn your eyes upon me. You are like something that... What countrywoman? Here of these shores?" Marina says, "No, nor of any shores. Yet I was mortally brought forth, and am no other than I appear." And I love that Marina is saying she's basically not born in any country because she was born at sea. I love that. But Pericles responds, "I am great with woe, and shall deliver weeping. My dearest wife was like this maid, and such a one my daughter might have been. My queen's square brows, her stature to an inch, as wand-like straight, as silver-voiced, her eyes as jewel-like, encased as richly. In pace another Juno, who starves the ears she feeds, and makes them hungry the more she gives them speech. Where do you live?" And Marina responds, "Where I am but a stranger. From the deck you may discern the place." And Pericles says, "Where were you bred? And how achieved you these endowments, which you make more rich to owe?" And she says, "If I should tell my history, it would seem like lies, disdained in the reporting." And Pericles responds, "Prithee speak. Falseness cannot come from thee, for thou look'st modest as justice, and thou seem'st a palace for the crowned truth to dwell in. I will believe thee, and make my senses credit thy relation to points that seem impossible. For thou look'st like one I loved indeed. What were thy friends? Didst thou not say, when I did push thee back, which was when I perceived thee, that thou camest from good descending?" And she says, "So indeed I did." And Pericles responds, "Report thy parentage. I think thou saidst thou hast been tossed from wrong to injury, and that thou thought'st thy griefs might equal mine, if both were opened." And Marina says, "Some such thing I said, and said no more but what my thoughts did warrant me as likely." And Pericles says, "Tell thy story. If thine considered prove the thousandth part of my endurance, thou art a man, and I have suffered like a girl. Yet thou dost look like patience gazing on kings' graves, and smiling extremity out of act. What were thy friends? How lost thou them? Thy name, my most kind virgin? Recount, I do beseech thee. Come, sit by me. She tells him, my name is Marina. And Pericles says, Oh, I am mocked, and thou by some incensed god sent hither to make the world to laugh at me. Marina says, Patience, good sir, or here I'll cease. And he says, Nay, I'll be patient. Thou little know'st how thou dost startle me to call thyself Marina. And Marina says, The name was given me by one that had some power, my father, and a king. And he says, How, a king's daughter, and called Marina? Marina says, You said you would believe me, but not to be a troubler of your peace, I will end here. Pericles says, But are you flesh and blood? Have you a working pulse? And are no fairy? Motion, well, speak on. Where were you born, and wherefore called Marina? Marina says, Called Marina, for I was born at sea. And Pericles says, At sea? What mother? Marina says, My mother was the daughter of a king, who died the minute I was born, as my good nurse Lycorida hath oft delivered, weeping. And Pericles says, Oh, stop there a little. And then as an aside he says, This is the rarest dream, that ere dull sleep did mock sad fools withal. This cannot be. My daughter's buried. Well, where were you bred? I'll hear you more, to the bottom of your story, and never interrupt you. She says, You'll scarce believe me, 'twere best I did give o'er. Pericles says, I will believe you by the syllable of what you shall deliver. Yet give me leave. How came you in these parts? Where were you bred? Marina says, The king my father did in Tarsus leave me, till cruel Cleon with his wicked wife did seek to murder me, and having wooed a villain to attempt it, who having drawn to it a crew of pirates came and rescued me, brought me to Mytilene. But, good sir, whither will you have me? Why do you weep? It may be you think me an impostor. No, good faith, I am the daughter to King Pericles, if good King Pericles be. And Pericles is overwrought here. He says, Ho, Helicanus! Cause, my lord, says Helicanus, thou art a grave and noble counselor, most wise in general. Tell me, if thou canst, what this maid is, or what is like to be, that thus hath made me weep. Helicanus says, I know not, but here is the regent, sir, of Mytilene. And Pericles, I'm going to skip a tiny bit. Pericles says, O Helicanus, strike me, honored sir. Give me a gash, put me to present pain, lest this great sea of joys rushing upon me o'erbear the shores of my mortality, and drown me with their sweetness. O come hither, thou that begett'st him that did thee beget, thou that was born at sea, buried at Tarsus, and found at sea again. O Helicanus, down on thy knees, thank the holy gods as loud as thunder threatens us. This is Marina. What was thy mother's name? Tell me but that, for truth can never be confirmed enough, though doubts did ever sleep. And Marina asks, First, sir, I pray, what is your title? I am Pericles of Tyre, but tell me now my drowned queen's name. As in the rest you said, thou'st been godlike perfect. Thou art the heir of kingdoms, and another life to Pericles, thy father. Marina says, Is it no more to be your daughter than to say my mother's name was Thaisa? Thaisa was my mother, who did end the minute I began. And Pericles says, Now, blessing on thee, rise, thou art my child. Give me fresh garments. Mine own Helicanus, she is not dead at Tarsus, as she should have been by savage Cleon. She shall tell thee all, when thou shalt kneel, and justify in knowledge. She is thy very princess. Who is this? And then Helicanus says, Sir, 'tis the governor of Mytilene, who, hearing of your melancholy state, did come to see you. And anyway, I just think that's lovely. My reading probably didn't do it a lot of justice. There is one more reunion scene after that. But anyway, I enjoyed Pericles a lot. I don't think it's perfect. Again, the plot does strain credulity, but I feel like Shakespeare does a good job of lulling you into suspending your disbelief. But for a lot of people, the plot will just be very improbable and hard to swallow. Another thing about this play that I think is unfortunate is that I think it does vary in quality from scene to scene quite a bit. It's one of the plays that is thought to not have been written by Shakespeare alone. It's probably written in part by at least one other playwright. And I think the consensus is that the first 2 acts of the play, at least, were not written by Shakespeare. And I kind of feel like you can tell. I kind of feel like you can tell that those first 2 scenes, those first 2 acts, just don't quite have that special Shakespeare juju sauce, if you forgive that term. And there's a notable change in the language after Act 2 ends. But even from there, I feel like it does vary quite a bit. There are some scenes that are a little bit jarring. In particular, the scenes that are in the brothel that Marina lives in for a while, those really stick out like a sore thumb because the whole rest of the play is so fantastical and in this sort of romance mode. But those scenes in the brothel are very much in the Shakespearean realism mode, which just feels very out of place. And yeah, so it's not perfect, but I think if you just look at it for what it is quite lovely, I think. I was really surprised by how much I liked it. I can see how it might work actually better on the stage than as a reading experience, because I think it would work really well as a performance. You know, I really think actors would make the text come to life better than the text on the page. Actually, I think Pericles would make a great opera. Actually, if a composer were to adapt it into an opera, I think it would be perfect for that. Because a lot of operas also have these improbable plots, melodramatic plots, fantastical elements certainly, and I think having music and singing along with those elements can help the audience to sort of buy into it, you know? And I think it could make for a really powerful opera, especially that reunion scene at the end. So I would love it if a composer did that. I'm not going to hold my breath on anyone ever doing it, but it would be cool. But anyway, I will leave it at that. If anyone else read Pericles for Shakestember, let me know what you thought. Or if you just read Pericles in general, let me know what you thought. But otherwise, that is, I think, what I have to say. And I will leave it at that and talk to you all again soon. Bye.